From the moment my life was turned upside down, all I wanted was to understand what really happened. What seemed like a normal summer afternoon turned into a nightmare so vivid and terrifying that I can hardly believe I lived to tell it. My story is one of those that seems fictional, but it is as real as the pain and fear I still carry. My name is Emily Johnson, and I am 16 years old. I have always been a curious young woman, seeking adventures and new experiences. I grew up in a small town on the outskirts of Boston, where time seemed to drag and local news was limited to what happened at school and in the neighboring houses. But even in a small town, some things have the power to turn someone's world upside down. And for me, what changed everything was the unexpected arrival of my cousin Martha. Martha Davis, my 17-year-old cousin, had a mysterious aura from the moment she arrived. She stood out at school with her exotic appearance and enigmatic behavior. Martha was involved in practices that many would consider peculiar. She was deeply interested in occultism, rituals, and everything beyond what most would consider normal. I had always heard rumors about her practicing witchcraft and rituals, but I never imagined it would affect my life so dramatically. When Martha came to stay with us for a weekend, I was excited but also a little apprehensive. She arrived loaded with large suitcases and boxes full of candles, old books, and other items I couldn't identify. At that time, I was an ordinary teenager, excited to see what an older cousin might bring to our routine, but also aware that Martha had a peculiar way of doing things. On the first night, after a quiet dinner, Martha suggested we hold a séance. I hesitated. The idea of communicating with spirits or entities was not something I felt comfortable with. However, Martha was so enthusiastic and insistent that I eventually agreed. She wanted to perform a simple ritual that she claimed was harmless and even fun. I remember clearly when the séance began. The room was lit only by the candles Martha had arranged in a circle, and the atmosphere seemed charged with a dense and almost palpable energy. Martha was reciting words in a strange language, and her voice was hypnotic. I felt uncomfortable but was also intrigued by the atmosphere and what was happening. At first, everything seemed fine. However, as the séance progressed, the feeling of discomfort I was experiencing increased. The air felt heavier, and I began to sense a presence, as if someone were watching me. Trying to ignore my growing anxiety, I continued with the ritual but started to feel a growing unease. It was then that the situation began to get even stranger. The candles started flickering, and a cold, inexplicable breeze began to blow through the room, even with the windows closed. I looked at Martha and saw that her expression had changed. She was with her eyes closed, concentrated, and appeared to be in a trance. The feeling of panic overtook me. I wanted to leave, but something seemed to keep me there, as if an invisible force were holding me in place. The room was now enveloped in a disturbing silence, interrupted only by the occasional flicker of a candle. I tried to move, but fear paralyzed me. When I finally managed to get up and move away, the panic was so intense that I began to cry. Martha seemed oblivious to my discomfort and continued with the ritual as if she were completely absorbed in her practices. The next morning, I woke up with an inexplicable sense of weakness. My body ached, and I had a persistent feeling that something was terribly wrong. I had a fever, and the fear had turned into something almost physical. I decided I needed to talk to Martha about what was happening, but she dismissed my concerns, saying I was just affected by suggestion and fear. Throughout the day, my symptoms worsened. I began to have hallucinations and feel a constant presence. The idea that someone was watching me intensified. I knew I needed to do something, but I didn't know where to start. The feeling that my life was being watched and manipulated was overwhelming. At night, my mind was filled with disturbing thoughts. The hallucinations became more frequent, and I was struggling to distinguish between reality and delusions. Desperate, I decided to confront Martha about what was happening. I went to the backyard where she was performing a more elaborate ritual, with candles arranged in complex patterns and a series of strange symbols drawn on the ground. When I found her, she was in a deep trance, murmuring words in a language I didn't understand. I called her, trying to interrupt the ritual and express how scared I was. Martha turned to me with an expression of anger and disdain. She seemed furious with my interruption, and her response was intense and aggressive. Without giving me a chance to explain, She grabbed a bottle of acid that was beside her and threw it at me. The pain was instant and unbearable. My body felt like it was on fire, and I screamed in pain as I tried to move away. All I could do was run, but the acid was burning my skin, and I felt as though I was being consumed by the pain. I lost consciousness, and my awareness began to fade. When I woke up, I was in a hospital. The environment was filled with doctors and nurses working to stabilize me. I was covered in bandages, and the pain was so intense that it felt like I was in a constant state of burning. My parents were by my side, with expressions of concern and sadness. They had received an anonymous call, and when they arrived at the scene, they found Martha gone and me in critical condition. The doctors informed me that I had suffered severe chemical burns and would need several surgeries and treatments to minimize the damage. The scars were deep and visible, and I knew my life would never be the same. The physical pain was only part of the suffering. The emotional and psychological impact was devastating. I was traumatized and terrified, and the feeling of betrayal and fear was overwhelming. The lack of answers about Martha's whereabouts only heightened my despair. The police conducted an extensive search, but she seemed to have disappeared without a trace. The idea that someone close to me could cause so much harm and then disappear without leaving any clues was terrifying and unsettling. In the following months, my life was marked by surgeries, treatments, and a long recovery. The physical pain was constant, but the emotional and psychological scars were even deeper. I had recurring nightmares about Martha and the rituals she performed, and my trust in people was shattered. I avoided dark places and was afraid to be alone. It was during this period of suffering that David, a longtime friend, entered my life in an unexpected way. David and I had known each other since childhood, but we had never been particularly close. However, he appeared to support me, offering a constant presence and a listening ear. His gestures of kindness and understanding were a welcome relief amid the chaos. David became a confidant and a dear friend. He was always there for me, helping me cope with the pain and distrust I felt. Over time, our friendship deepened and turned into something more meaningful. David was a beacon of light amid the darkness I was facing. He encouraged me to seek professional help and explore therapy as a way to confront the trauma. Therapy was a challenging but essential experience. I began working with a psychologist specializing in trauma, who helped me understand and process the complex emotions I was experiencing. Therapy provided me with tools to cope with anxiety, fear, and pain, and helped me find ways to rebuild my confidence and self-esteem. In addition to therapy, I began to engage in activities that brought me joy and a sense of normalcy. Life went on, and I was determined to find a balance between the past and the present. Returning to school was a challenge, but also a way to reclaim a part of my life that had been interrupted. Facing the stigma and discomfort was difficult, but I was determined to move forward. Returning to school was a monumental challenge. My classmates were aware of what had happened, and the atmosphere at school changed drastically. Many showed sympathy, but there were those who didn't know how to handle my situation and looked at me with curiosity or even a hint of fear. There was a constant sense that everyone was trying to understand what had happened, and that only increased my discomfort. I felt as if I were living in a bubble of pain and distrust, but at the same time, I knew I needed to face these difficulties to rebuild my life. The school routine became a space to try to normalize my existence, but the feeling of being watched and the constant reminder of the trauma were still present. I spent most of my time alone, keeping a safe distance from other students, and focused on my studies as a form of distraction and escape. David continued to be my pillar of support. He was always available to listen to my concerns and offer advice. Our relationship grew beyond friendship, and we began to find comfort in each other. He was an anchor amidst the storm of uncertainties and fears I faced. One night, while we were talking about what had happened and how we were dealing with the aftermath, David suggested that we seek a way to better understand what had happened and possibly find some answers. I hesitated, but the idea of getting answers about Martha and her disappearance intrigued me. We decided to seek help from experts who could provide us with information or insights into occult practices and rituals. This journey led us to a well-known expert in occultism and ancient rituals, Dr. William Harper. He was a respected scholar in the field and had a reputation for helping those affected by esoteric practices. Dr. Harper agreed to meet with us and hear our story. In our first meeting with Dr. Harper, He listened attentively as I recounted everything I knew about Martha and the events of that night. His expression was a mixture of interest and concern, and he asked many questions about the details of the ritual and the experiences I had undergone. He explained that rituals and occult practices can have unpredictable effects, especially when they involve the manipulation of forces that we don't fully understand. During our consultations, Dr. Harper provided insights into occult practices and made connections with what I had experienced. He spoke about how certain rituals could create an opening for external influences and how some practices could have unintended side effects, including the sensation of being watched or the creation of disturbing presences. Dr. Harper believed that somehow, the ritual Martha had conducted might have opened a door to something not fully understood, and that this could have contributed to the hallucinations and fear I was experiencing. As we continued our search for answers, David and I also sought support from trauma survivor groups. Through these groups, I met others who had gone through similar experiences and were facing similar challenges. Sharing my experiences with people who understood the pain and fear was a relief and helped me better cope with my emotions. Gradually, I began to feel a small sense of control returning to my life. Therapy, David's support, and the understanding I was gaining about what had happened were helping me find a new balance. I was starting to accept that while the trauma had changed my life, I could still find ways to move forward and create a meaningful life for myself. Recovery was slow and filled with ups and downs. There were days when I felt I was making progress, and others when the pain and fear seemed unbearable. However, I was determined not to let the trauma define my life forever. Over time, I learned to manage my scars, both physical and emotional. The mystery surrounding Martha's disappearance was never fully resolved. The police continued their search, but without success. The absence of answers left a void in my life, and I found myself struggling to find a sense of closure. The idea that my cousin had vanished somewhere, with her occult practices and intentions, was unsettling, but I needed to move on. Years passed, and life went on. I graduated in psychology and started working at a mental health clinic, specializing in helping people who had experienced trauma. The work was challenging, but also deeply rewarding. I felt that I was using my own experience to make a difference in other people's lives and help them overcome their own difficulties. David and I continued our journey together. Our friendship evolved into a loving relationship, and eventually, we built a life together. The arrival of our daughter Lily brought a new joy and hope into our lives. Each day with her was a gift and a reminder that, despite the challenges we faced, life continued to offer moments of beauty and happiness. The experience I went through was a nightmare and a journey of self-discovery. The pain and trauma were intense, but they also taught me about resilience, courage, and the human capacity to overcome adversity. Although the scars of the past never completely disappear, I learned to find balance and live a meaningful life. What happened to Martha remains a mystery, but I found a way to move forward and build a life filled with love, hope, and purpose. My story is a reminder that even in the darkest situations, it is possible to find light and strength to carry on. Life may be unpredictable and cruel, but it can also be filled with moments of beauty and redemption.